All right, a couple of episodes ago, if you remember, we were discussing an article from the New York Times that referenced a survey from them and Siena College, which found just about 1% of 18 to 29-year-olds strongly approve of the way President Biden is handling his job. And then 94% of Democrats under the age of 30 said they wanted another candidate to run 2 years from now. Well, joining us is the writer of that article, New York Times politics reporter Maya King. Maya, Mike Leon, Nick Savari, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast with us.
Hi, thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. Maya, we really enjoyed the piece and we referenced it a couple episodes ago and Nick did his get off my lawn speech to younger voters out there to try to energize them.
Get off my lawn, because that implies like, hey, I don't want you part of this. It's more inclusive, like we need you a part of this. Like these numbers are, frightening.
You were yelling at them, but you can go check out that episode. But anyway, all that will be edited out. Maya, but for people who have not read the article, okay, we covered it like I mentioned. It's a great piece. You could check it out on the New York Times site and app. Take us inside some of the polling data that I just mentioned that you referenced in the article, and then the personal stories of the people that you interviewed for the piece and the piece overall.
Sure. The New York Times is fortunate in that we have a pretty robust polling system. And our first big midterm election poll, we talked to folks across the political spectrum, race, demographic, age, political leaning. The story that I wrote with my colleague, Jonathan Weissman, focuses on the results that we found from younger voters. I think one of the biggest findings that this poll reveals, specifically for voters under the age of 30, so 18 to 29, just 1% approve of the way that Joe Biden is doing his job. We have a couple of other data points that show an overall or underline the theme that younger voters are very fed up with leadership in Washington and generally upset and distrustful in large part of their leaders. And we were able to reach out to a number of the folks that we polled to ask them exactly why they were so upset, to try to get some voices behind that 1% number and some voices behind the right track, wrong track figure that we also have in the poll, which is also significantly lower among younger voters. And essentially what we heard from them was that leaders in Washington, leaders who are running my state, the folks who are in charge, are too old and too rigid to be able to rise to the occasion in the face of the number of crises that are taking place in the country. Chief among them, for younger voters, the big issues were climate change, the economy, and the affordability of virtually anything, particularly though student loans. What all of these things have in common are along this feeling, or I suppose the reality, that they could get worse in the long term, and that leaders, particularly those over the age of 70, don't understand the long-term implications of a lot of these issues because they've lived through a time when things were fine, and because they won't be around when things get really bad, which is what a lot of these voters feel this country is headed towards.
Maya, not too long ago in the winter of 2021, it was Medicaid or Medicare. I always get these two mixed up, state and federally. One of which was, of course, passed through. More funding was directed toward that, coming out of Congress. Most recently, we had about $600 billion, I believe, that had been allocated for Pentagon funding. We see a trend that things are important for aging citizens, senior citizens, almost entirely get through Congress. Whereas something like student loan debt relief is just being put through executive action. It's all temporary solutions. The trend continues to be that the needs of younger voters, millennials, Gen Z, to a little extent, potentially even our Generation X, are still not being met. When we look at the rest of the world, like some of our youngest leaders here in Finland, Bhutan, the world is scaling younger, with national leaders. Whereas in the United States, we tend to scale older. And I say all this because if the young people's response from the interviews you did was to say that we're checking out, that this isn't appealing to us, what is their response to how to bring about change if it's not through the polling places?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. You're asking essentially what would be their response to this trend of basically folks sort of trending younger, but the policy's not matching that age
A
group?
little bit of that, but also, the data that came from, from your article talks about the fact that younger voters, at least, by percentages, are just not as interested in voting, like with these particular candidates coming up. And my question is, if it's not through voting, how do the younger voters that you interviewed think that policy or any type of laws, the things that matter to them, will ever be brought to fruition?
I see. Well, it's interesting. One voter that we spoke with, who was 25 years old, went to college for data analytics, but drives a truck for Amazon now, very fed up with the direction of the country, but has been voting. However, the way that he votes is different. He wrote in God for president, saying that if anybody's going to get us out of this, it's a higher power. And then did the same for a number of the top of ticket races in 2020, but was laser focused on local initiatives and ballot initiatives, constitutional amendments in California. That was where he felt like he could make the most impact. So there's one example of someone who's really fed up with leadership, but is still going to try to do what he thinks is best. Other folks that we spoke with, other young people, really weren't sure what they were going to do, because staying home is not the best option, but the options that they do have on the ballot, they don't necessarily agree with either. A lot of the people that we spoke to who were in states like California, Colorado, Kentucky, Tennessee, wish they could vote for Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but they couldn't because they're not in New York. And so I think that it's now incumbent upon these groups who profess to mobilize and turn out and appeal to young voters to start to put forth some candidates and policies that actually appeal to those groups, because that is probably one of the biggest unspoken parts of this story that we try to get at, but it's a really big dynamic of young people who are really fed up but don't often feel like there's much they can do. And I'll add to that, to your earlier point about folks being younger but the policies not matching that. I think that older leaders, older politicians view a lot of the policies that stand to directly impact voters under 30 as far too progressive, too far to the left to actually be viable, particularly on climate change. I know that the Green New Deal, really for moderate Democrats and Republicans, has been very vilified. It's kind of a bad word, a bad phrase to use. However, the idea of sweeping legislation to combat climate change is kind of a non-starter at this point on the Hill. And really just sweeping legislation, period, to combat a lot of these issues is really thought of as far too progressive. And I think that's another source of the frustration for younger voters.
Adding to the story of that 25-year-old you had mentioned, who I remember his quote about like being focused, locally, the issues that matter most to him. Was there a sense also that maybe there's a separation of engagement, that at the national level, we're seeing, what seems to be the Joe Bidens, the Donald Trumps, like really just old people, quite honestly, that continue to dominate the stage. But is the opportunity that they're seeing more in the local sense of at the town council, mayor, Board of Ed, being able to infuse more youth into local positions of power?
I don't know if it's that they see the opportunity to infuse more youth more than they just see it as an opportunity to actually get tangible changes, to pass tangible legislation. And that if you can look at someone in their face and listen to them and talk with them about the policy that they're trying to pass, whether it's on the neighborhood level or the city level or even state house district, that is a lot easier to swallow and easier to mobilize behind than a law in Congress or even a presidential candidate like Joe Biden, who, as a number of voters pointed out to us in our reporting, made a lot of promises to voters across the Democratic spectrum, including young voters, though, particularly on student loans. And they haven't seen those policies come to pass. In fact, they've kind of heard the opposite, which is I'm not willing to budge on anything higher. I think the threshold now is $10,000. And then it's also got an income limit as well. There are a lot of young voters who are, or just young people who are really struggling, who are hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt and are saying that's simply not enough. So I think that's a part of this too.
Yeah. Maya, I wanted to ask you, because staying on voting, why it matters. Obviously, the midterms are coming up in November. Republicans generally, at least from a data perspective, and we've done some recent episodes on this, and some guests have mentioned this, they tend to vote more, in the off years, in the midterm years, while Democrats tend to sit it out. So the people that you interviewed in this article, do they know that? Stupid question. Do they know that? Do they know that seeing that type of data, if I saw that type of data, I would say, well, then Republicans are definitely going to take back the House and maybe even the Senate. So then further policies that I would want, enacted legislatively, people that represent what you mentioned, climate change, right? Student loan debt. We're not going to get anything passed if I was a Democrat. We're not going to get anything passed if I sit it out. What says the politics reporter at New York Times who was interviewing these folks? Do they know that? Do they understand the importance of the ballot box?
All of the people that we talk to who are again 18 to 29-year-olds. So that's from the voter who voted for the very first time in 2020 to someone like me at 25, 26, who's only voted 2 or 3 times, are pretty avid voters. These are also people who saw and participated in the largest protest movement that our country has seen in history in the summer of 2020, and actually felt galvanized to head to the polls for both a pro-change, anti-Trump vote. And still, I believe the people that we spoke to, again, these are people who were polled by the New York Times. So it's also, a specific subset of youth. They all are pretty set on participating again in November. Some of them are holding their nose and casting a ballot, but I think that 2020 really shook a lot of young people into the understanding of the importance of their vote, even if the people that did ultimately get into office have proven rather disappointing to them. While you were asking that question, I was looking at one data point that we found here, which is that nearly more than almost a third, but more than 1 in 4 young voters actually didn't know or refused to say which party they wanted to control Congress. And I think that's worth mentioning because it underlines this element of what's the word to describe it? That young voters just maybe don't quite know what they want to see amid the chaos, because both parties now seem like neither party seems like a great option.
Shifting gears to the South, where you reside, paying attention to voters down there. I want to call attention to someone that does seem to be galvanizing younger voters, or who's just galvanizing a voting base that I don't think Joe Biden seems to be drawing attention to, which is Stacey Abrams. Mike, just in where you are, the reporting you're doing, what seems to be working, for Abrams' campaign? Because it does seem, I wouldn't say more robust. That's not the word I want to use here, but I'm going to sort of put as a placeholder. But there seems to be a different, broader attempt or strategy that we didn't see in her previous election against Brian Kemp, which rightfully so was basically taken from her for the nonsense that the GOP did in Georgia. But what's your sense of that? Like, how does Ms. Abrams appeal to voters across the aging spectrum?
Money. Being well-funded, having millions and millions of dollars to hire staff who are based in Georgia or in the South and understand the complexities of these different counties and communities, to flood the airwaves with ads that appeal to teachers, farmers, young voters, older voters. My parents in Tallahassee actually have gotten a ton of Stacey Abrams ads because the Florida-Georgia line is one media market. So they too have been saturated with pro-Abrams content. And on top of that, she has this built-in fundraising and organizing apparatus through Fair Fight, which was founded in 2018 and trained up in the last 4 years leagues of young organizers who have gone on to work on her campaign, Senator Raphael Warnock's reelection campaign, a number of the other Democratic down ballot races, which are proving to be a lot more impactful in light of a number of laws passed in Georgia recently. And this sense, I think, among all voters in Georgia, or Democratic voters, I should say, that Abrams gets it, that she understands that she's homegrown, went to school in Atlanta, and has a grasp on the issues that matter to them. I really think it boils down to her fundraising apparatus, but I will add the caveat that she has so far. In my journalistic lens, she has spent that money to her advantage, because organizing a winning campaign in Georgia is more than just throwing a lot of cash at it.
Maya, I'm glad that you got asked a question about Georgia, because Georgia was a major reason why President Biden is the president of the United States. You wrote a piece about Herschel Walker recently. You did a piece on Stacey Abrams and obviously her run for governor, like Nick just asked, and how she wants to put abortion at the center of the campaign. So I want to ask you holistically, I know you covered the South, but besides Georgia, and you can weigh in on Georgia as well, what do you see playing out in November? Now that you did a piece on young voters don't like any of these people. And so who knows if they come out to the ballot box. We've got a bunch of key races happening in different House and Senate seats. There's people that are not running for reelection. I forget the number of how many open House of Representatives, the seats there are that are going to be contested in November. What's your take? What are some races that you're watching? I know you covered the South as a focus, but what are some races that you're watching, how you see playing out specifically in the state that you are currently living in Georgia?
Broad strokes themes, one of the biggest things that's playing out in the South that I think is so interesting but hasn't been very widely discussed is this proliferation of Black candidates for statewide offices that have long been elusive to Black folks. So we have 2 Black men running for a Senate seat in Georgia. That's never happened before in Georgia history. Sherry Beasley in North Carolina, the Democratic nominee in that state, where we saw unprecedented unity behind her campaign. Val Demings in Florida, very similar. Tim Scott is running for re-election, though very much on a glide path there in South Carolina. I think that is a huge, it's a victory for representation, sure, though I suppose we're sort of past now talking a lot about representation on the ballot. However, in these offices, like the Senate, like the governor's mansion, of course, with Stacey running, this has never been seen before. And the kind of money and institutional support that is getting poured into these races is just remarkable to me, and something that is not lost on me. I think that's one big theme that I can point to across the South. Another thing that I'll be watching for in November is you're seeing also in a number of these southern states, particularly North Carolina and Mississippi, a little bit in Alabama, but those are the 2 places that I followed a bit. Also Arkansas, where I didn't mention Chris Jones running against Sarah Huckabee Sanders, another Black man trying to make it into a governor's mansion. There are people who are trying to recreate the Abrams model of running up the score in these heavily Democratic these cities, southern cities in their respective states, and then turning out in high levels, usually rural Black folks or rural, low income, low turnout voters that might lean Democratic, to try to turn these otherwise ruby red states either purple or just kind of push them in that direction. A lot of people have tried to apply the Abrams model to their respective states. November will be a test of whether or not the Abrams model is one size fits all, if that can be something that can be recreated for these marquee top of ticket races, or if it's effective for congressional or even state house races, which is another dynamic I think we're seeing now, where Democrats have woken up to the reality that a number of these policies, particularly on abortion and on election law, I think those are the 2 biggest. The state houses are incubators, or were incubators of those laws, as we see them all the way up to the Supreme Court. So they've realized that when you're talking about mobilizing voters and flipping seats, it really also needs to happen if their party wants to be successful at the state house level too. So those are my sweeping my sweeping takes for the South as I see it now 5 months into my tenure.
And we will come back in November and play that audio.
Right.
She's a fantastic politics reporter over at the New York Times. You check her out, follow her on Twitter. She's a great follow on Twitter. She wrote these fantastic pieces, support journalism. So go check out those articles on the New York Times app or site. Maya King, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I truly appreciate it. Can't thank you enough, and continued success to you. And please stay safe.
Thank you. You as well. Thank you so much for having me. Really, really glad we could have the conversation.